Good morning. Welcome to this second session in a four-part series that we're doing on religious art. So grateful to see new faces and some faces from last week too. Just a note that John Sandy, our next door neighbor from Glass Endeavors, his presentation from last week is available on our Vimeo channel, the church's Vimeo channel. So if you weren't able to be here or be online for that particular presentation, go back and take a listen and engage with that, because each of these presentations is really standalone, but we're actually hoping to build a conversation as a community over the course of these 4 weeks. I'm not going to review all of the information that I started with last week, but I am going to review some of those spectrums that I offered up for self-reflection as we began last week. As we engage in these conversations about religious art, I invite you, and I invite myself, to have an understanding or to grow in our understanding of the church. How do we understand the church? Is it in flux, or does it stand the test of time? What about our understanding of art? Does it speak for a time, or is it preserved for all time? What about our relationship to the built world? Stuff matters, or we're more Marie Kondo? How has the space, this particular church space, connected to our lives? Has it functioned as home, or never quite felt like you belong? And finally, our understanding of change. Does change nullify the past, or does it build on the past? And as I said last week, all of those spectrums are too simple, but they help us to sort of understand how, in addition to our social location that is often connected to age and gender and sexuality and race and class, these questions help us to locate ourselves so that we can also listen to the locations of others. So with that, it's my great delight to welcome, I'm gonna knock things off here. Dr. Jennifer Oz Freeman, who I understand just was promoted into the role of professor at associate professor at United. So we delight in that achievement for her. And she is the program director of arts and theology at United Theological Seminary in the Twin Cities. She came to United in 2018 after teaching at the University of St. Thomas as a Louisville Institute postdoc fellow. She received her PhD in 2016 from Vanderbilt University, where she specialized in the relationship between art and theology in the Middle Ages. And today, one of the primary questions that she's going to help us to talk about is, how is art theological? So let's welcome Dr. Jennifer Oz Freeman.
Good morning. It's okay if I can see my face. Thank you for the introduction and for the invitation, for the welcome. It's lovely to be with you today. I'm coming from another Holy Trinity in St. Paul, Holy Trinity Orthodox Church. And it's wonderful to be here. I'm a medieval art historian. I also have a background in theater and visual art myself. So my approach to historical theology and art history is also as a practitioner. And maybe we'll bring some of that to this conversation. I'm hoping what I can do here, and because I'm an art historian, I get greedy with images and I tend to put too many images in my presentations, but I'll try to be mindful of time and maybe hope that you can yank me off the stage if it's getting too long. But I'd like to give some preliminary, maybe kinds of categories in thinking about this question of how is art theological. There's a lot of ways that we could phrase and rephrase that question. How does art make theological meaning? In my role as the program director of theology and the arts at United, I often in my spiel to folks will say that there's something a little misleading about the title theology and the arts for our program, because conjunctions, while they bring things together, also imply that they're bringing together two discrete things, right? As if you have theology over here and art over here, and the conjunction brings them together. Rather, what I argue and the basically underlying premise of my program is that art is theology. Art is capable of making theological meaning in its own right. And so sometimes that's very illustrative of texts in a straightforward way, but more often than not, it's in tension with textual theology or layered or complementary to it in these various ways. So it's complicated. And a really important start is just to acknowledge that fact. Okay. So another way of posing this is, what do the arts even have to do with religion and theology? And I have to tell you that it's so exciting to me that your community is having these conversations, because really all religious communities should have this kind of conversation, ideally multiple points in their kind of lifetime as a community. So I'm going to posit kind of a few things before I get into some examples for us, and then with some time for conversation. So we can always come back to these things in discussion, but I think you'll be speaking amongst yourselves as well. So a few things. The arts are cultural, as is theology, right? So art, like theology, is always contextual. It has an original context. It maybe has an original intended audience. That context and audience changes over time, and thus the received meaning of it changes over time, just like with texts, right? And this is an important thing to push back on or to assert with anti-racist work, because in the realm of theology and theological education, there's traditionally been systematic theology, which is generally white European men, especially Germans. And then there's your contextual theology classes, right? So this will be liberation theology, Black and womanist theology, and so on. As if the white European mid-20th century theology does not also have a context. In fact, it has a very important context, which is post-World War II, a lot of the times, right? So thankfully in theological education, these things are being laid bare, and some of that's being acknowledged, but we still see that bias really in the construction of our classes and in our curricula. Not at United, certainly. Just kidding. We also have lots of work to do. So art, like theology, is always contextual. First, we need to understand it in its original context before we can kind of critique it, unpack it, retire it, rehabilitate it, whatever the case may be. We can value the arts as historical documentation. As a historian of the church, I always try to convince my logocentric colleagues that if you're teaching theology and not engaging the arts, you are not fully engaging theology, because art history is an important part of the theological record and religious experience, and we'll come back to that in a second. A constructive piece is that I would affirm the arts as prophetic in nature. And we've seen this in our own community after the murder of George Floyd, with public art and mural making that is calling out for justice and accountability, right? And then there's a very important one, the relationship of arts to the liturgy. and to worship. That can either be a help or a hindrance. You can also think of this really easily, I think, in architectural context, right? You've had that experience where an architectural space really helps you worship, and there's other spaces where it seems to really fight against the ability to worship, right? And likewise, maybe in a professional context, there's nothing worse than a low-ceilinged room with terrible lighting, and it's really depressing or whatever, right? So our spaces, whether aware of them or not, affect how we feel, and they affect our ability to function. Okay, so that's not an exhaustive list, but a few things to get us started. Another thing that I would posit is that, or to think about, is that there are some things that the arts can do that textual theology can't do. And I'll leave that kind of open-ended maybe to muse on. Some other important premises. The fact that art is theological, so the fact that I'm saying how is art theological as opposed to is art theological, we're starting from the very assertion that art is theological, okay? We can have a whole nother conversation, but the fact that you're having this series tells me that you're on board with this, right? So the fact that we're asserting that art is theological implies in it an affirmation of the goodness of creation and the goodness of materiality, right? Because art can do this, because material creation and human creation can be theological, affirms to us the goodness of it, at least in some degree. So we could tie that to incarnational theology, which indeed during the Byzantine iconoclastic controversy in the 8th century, theologians did do that. Okay. Another kind of question we could think about, I don't mean to barrage you with questions, hopefully they'll just kind of get things percolating and we can come back to them. We might think about religious or theological art as being constructive by definition, by which I mean that art has a kind of discursiveness that is distinct from texts. What I mean by that is there's no such thing as like a simple illustration of a text by an image. And this is simply because there's often a lack of detail especially when we're talking about biblical text. So a classic example of this is depictions of Jesus, actually, because the New Testament texts give us very little information about the physical appearance of Jesus. And yet we have almost 2,000 years of images of this person, Jesus, right? And so artists have had to innovate, they've had to interpret, and of course, that's a major part of, or the part of the backdrop of this very conversation. So there's a lack of detail in the text, and then artists fill that in. Art is also revisionist and reimagining, and some of the questions that you posed, in your opening comments were perfect, spot on for that. Okay, we want to get into our slides, and we can come back to this image perhaps, but I have a sense maybe we won't have time to. But it's by a Turkish artist and is a kind of reference to Caravaggio's Doubting Thomas. But another important part of this, and Orlando Espín does not write explicitly about the arts, but I take his work to kind of help me make an argument for incorporating the arts into theological education, whether in a seminary context or in a church context, because I would assert that using material culture in this way offers a way of recovering voices and experiences that have been historically undervalued and generally not preserved in the textual record. So especially of women and of people of color in history. So when we're engaging theological arts, to not just engage quote unquote high art, and this is where like the Renaissance folks kind of immediately come to mind with these grand images, but to also value material culture. So things like embroidery or metalwork, or these things that historically have not also been valued in museum collections because they've been associated often with women's work, which is a whole nother conversation we don't have time for. But just to say for now that we want to, because we're interested in theological meaning making, we want to open up also what we consider art. So more ephemeral art, again, protest art would fall into this category. So, oops, and excuse me, there's a typo in his name there. Orlando, no, only one cross out that second O. So he writes, and because Christianity is first and foremost a way of living, it cannot be understood apart from the lives of the vast majority of Christians who, through the last 20 centuries, have mostly been poor, illiterate, and marginalized. A telling of Christian history that mostly reflects the faith, theologies, and lives of literate dominant elites in church and society over the past 20 centuries is a suspect telling. This is just comes down, you could even consider it based on numbers. He's saying for most of Christian history, most Christians have not been producing theological texts. They have not been engaging with theological texts directly, but their theological meaning making has been in kitchens, has been around a hearth singing songs, has been creating textiles together. And it's true that we can't grasp all of that because it's been not preserved. But it's a really important first step is to acknowledge that that is part of the history of Christianity, right? And we have to do our best to try and understand that as we can. So this is part of I'm basically laying out my, I guess, the undergirding for this. So I'm going to move pretty quickly, and actually I realize I don't have my clock isn't showing up on my screen. But I'm going to move pretty quickly through some examples in these categories. Again, hopefully just to kind of get things percolating. We could do a deep dive on all of these. I want to suggest a few ways that the arts do this theological meaning making. The most obvious one is in content or subject matter. So, an image of the nativity, and this motif, and so therefore it's theological. It's illustrating a biblical story. But I think these others are just as important. The material that's used to create an artwork also conveys theological meaning in a way. There's a saying, form is content, is one way of putting that. The composition and the context in which an artwork appears. So where is it located in your worship space, for example, conveys theological meaning. Classic example I always give is baptistries. It matters. Is your baptismal font in a closet somewhere and you just bring it out when somebody's baptized? Maybe you only baptize folks in actual bodies of water, and so that's why it's not in the church. Maybe it's at the very center, so every time you enter your space, you're reminded of your baptism, right? There's not a right or wrong way, but just to be aware that each of those choices conveys theological meaning to your community and to visitors. And then also the very process of creating art can convey theological or spiritual meaning. Okay, so I'll give some examples of these kind of quickly. So you're probably familiar with this image. You've maybe seen it at some point in your life, whether probably most likely reproduced. It's a very highly reproduced image in America. It's Our Lady of Guadalupe. The original dates to 1531, which was 10 years after the Spanish conquest, the Aztecs. And Mary miraculously appeared, this image, on the cloak of the peasant Juan Diego after she had appeared to him in a vision where she spoke to him in his native language. And this is a whole very complex story. You talk about colonization and the function of this kind of vision and so on. I show it to you because it is a recognizable image that then was riffed on or reinterpreted by Alma Lopez, who's a Mexican-born queer Chicana artist. This work is titled Our Lady, dates to 1999. And she's both taking this very famous image that in some ways is tied to ideas of liberation, but is complicated. And so she's using that, we can see the mandorla, kind of scalped mandorla around the figure's body. The cloak that she's wearing, instead of being covered in stars, is covered with iconography of the Aztec moon goddess. So she's juxtaposing Catholic iconography with the iconography of indigenous religion, and is reappropriating both of those things in this kind of very powerful image. The woman who agreed to be photographed for the piece agreed to do so as an expression of reclaiming her body after having been raped. So, and the model practices indigenous spirituality herself. So Lopez made this image, It was, as you may expect, very controversial at the time. And in fact, there's a book called Our Lady of Controversy where you can read more about that. And this is also maybe part of a bigger conversation too, to notice how contemporary artists, whether they identify as Christian or not, often engage with historical Christian iconography in very powerful ways. And sometimes they're initially received as being disrespectful. And I have a couple more classic examples of that in my slides. But I think if we're patient and we sit with it a little bit longer, we see that there's actually a power there, which is why artists are still drawn to using such iconography. I have a few examples of this. So in medium, the very material that we use in art making can be theological. So it matters whether you're engaging using paint or stained glass windows. I'm going to show you a very, let's see if this works. Yeah. I'm going to talk over this because it's a silent film. So this is, oops, no, Cecil B. DeMille's, we'll see. A film about the light of Jesus. This is the very first opening moments of the film. And so it's silent. It starts with Jesus's ministry. So it starts with Jesus as an adult. What we're seeing here is a blind child who is in the process of being healed by Jesus. So of course, film, we think of, pre-digital film, of course, right? Film is actually this projection of light through, what do you call it? Film. And so you see here, he says, oh, I begin to see the light. So the child is being healed and is seeing the light, quote unquote. Now the face of Jesus will begin to emerge in this aura of light. And we, the film goer, are also having a vision, right? We're also seeing this light projected on the screen. And so you have to, it's kind of hard to imagine, but you have to think back to early 20th century to imagine what it would be like for a film goer to see light projected in this kind of way. Now, another thing to unpack here is also the whitewashing of Jesus and that long history, which we could do a whole nother series on. And here's the kind of the end of the clip where the child runs to him. And it's through this actually, popular media, Warner Solomon's Head of Jesus in the mid 20th century is one of the most reproduced images of Christian art and is one of the main culprits in this kind of whitewashing of Jesus because it was so pervasive in American culture. Okay, so one example, light, which of course we could also link to stained glass windows. These are just a few of the stained glass windows by the artist Kehinde Wiley. You can see actually Mia has one of his large paintings on display in the permanent collection. But what Wiley has done, and he has his MFA from Yale University, he's New York based. He's also studied in Russia and other places. But what he does in his work, as you can see from these examples, is he takes the kind of artwork of so-called like European masters, so Renaissance era, Baroque era artwork, and takes those compositions and reimagines them centering Black figures. Not just Americans, but he travels worldwide and will recruit his models from the street. So he'll approach somebody and say, would you like to model for me? He'll show them the kind of work that he does. And then he says, okay, how would you like to pose? So it's very much about empowering that model to say how they want to present themselves to the world. So it's very much a collaboration in terms of that composition. Mary McCleary is a Christian artist. Her work uses discarded materials. So here's a detail of the types of things that her works are composed of. She says, I like the irony of using materials that are often trivial, foolish, and temporal to express ideas of what is significant, timeless, and transcendent. And you'll notice in this image, this grid of eyes, she uses these grid of googly eyes a lot of the times as a kind of symbol of God's omnipresence. God is seeing this as kind of one of her functions. Zhang Huan has a series of sculptures, and this one is actually displayed facing a similar sculpture of a bust of Buddha. He created this work in 2011 after becoming Buddhist in 2005 when he moved back to China. And it's created from the ash from incense in a Buddhist temple, which I think is a really lovely and powerful image of, when you think of ash, incense ash, as the kind of physical remnants of prayer, really. So incense is this, in many traditions, including the Christian tradition, right, and based on the Psalms, that our prayer arises like incense. So he's actually created a sculpture out of residual prayer. It's like kind of how I think of that. Mark Quinn is a British artist who was part of a group called the Young British Artists. They're no longer that young, but along with Chris Ophelia and Damien Hirst, who created some very provocative art in terms of the material they chose. This is a sculpture of his own head from his own blood. So he, over time, had his own blood drawn, and it's frozen in this way. So there's a conservation issue there where you have to keep it frozen, or you'll have a mess on your hands. But what he's thinking about is mortality in his own kind of case. I think a Christian interpretation of this work could then also think about incarnational theology, Eucharistic theology, and mortality, and things like that. These are, non-traditional materials, we'll say, but contemporary artists are doing a lot of very deep spiritual and religious thinking with non-traditional materials. Okay. Context, very important in a religious community. And what I mean by context is that artworks are often will have multiple works in the same space, right? So there may be an image in your apse or above your altar, an image on your altar, images in the nave processing along, and all of these things work in concert together. I'm showing you an example from the early Christian catacombs. So there's a kind of a tricky thing here. We have the Good Shepherd in the ceiling of this catacomb. And the Good Shepherd was an image that was used in the Mediterranean in the ancient world for thousands of years before Christians adopted it in their iconography. There's of course, because it's, there were actual shepherds. So it's not uncommon, of course. But also rulers who presented themselves as shepherds of the people. And I have a little book out about this last year, this long history. But the point being here is that when we find a shepherd image like this, unless we know more about the context, we can't say actually whether it's a Christian good shepherd, or maybe it's the god Hermes, or maybe it's a philanthropic image of kind of the virtue of philanthropy. In this instance, because there are, we know the identity of the patron of the catacomb, but also because we see the three youths in the fiery furnace over here on this side, that gives us a sense that it's a Christian catacomb, actually. It's a Hebrew Bible image. And likewise, the peacock, and then we have an Oran's figure. So kind of reading those images together can help us to identify the intended audience. There are other instances where, say, if you have an image of Jesus healing on one side, and Moses striking the rock and water coming from it on the other side, we can think about Jesus is often depicted with a staff. So there's a link to then, in those contexts, Jesus and Moses, right? Hope that makes sense. I think for time, I won't go into this one. This is the baptistry at Dura Europos, which is the earliest surviving Christian baptistry that we have. It dates to 250. It's now at the Yale University Art Gallery. Very Indiana Jones situation there, but they have a great resource on their website, so I'd encourage you to learn more about that. Another Good Shepherd image. Process is also a way that work can be spiritual or religious in nature. An obvious example, and one from my own tradition, is that of icon painting or writing, in which every step is ascribed theological meaning. So the first base layer is a red clay that is calling back to the creation narrative in Genesis. And the whole process is one of ascent from dark to light, where you're laying on darker colors and going towards the enlightenment of the kind of top layer. One of my favorite elements of this is the application of gold, which if you've ever worked with gold leaf, you put on the layer of like gum or different things you can use for this. And then the artist blows on it like that to create enough moisture that the gold leaf will adhere to it. So very much an enlivening of the artwork in that way. And there's great resources online of videos that kind of narrate this. The Proserpine School in New York City is one example of that. I realized I haven't been looking sufficiently at the camera. I'm sorry to the Zoomers. Tibetan sand painting is another, I think, kind of captivating example of this, where actually, is created to be destroyed in essence, and that it's the very process then of creating it that is the spiritual act, a ritual creation and destruction of this kind of geometric palace for deities. Okay. One piece is I'm concluding my remarks here, and I hope I'm doing it in a timely fashion, which I forgot. 10:30? Okay, perfect, great. It's almost as if I've planned it, that's great. This is another huge category, but when we talk about religious images, of course, part of that history or thinking about how art has been theological is also the destruction of images or iconoclasm. And there's a few terms we would use here. Iconoclasm is literally image breaking, so destruction of images. There's another related word that's good to know, which is aniconism. And that's, you can think of as like a resistance to images, a kind of, I'd prefer not to have images. So it's not an active destruction of, but is maybe reflecting communities that tend to not have. So for example, Islamic tradition is often referred to as aniconic. Now, of course, there is a very rich tradition of Islamic art, including Islamic figural art, but we will not find you'll find images of Muhammad in history texts. You're not going to find images of him in the Quran, right? So there's certain places where images are licit and illicit. And that's true for many, also true of various Christian denominations. So there's a long history here of iconoclasm. The two examples I'm showing you here are of contemporary artworks, so not in a religious context. The one on the left is Chrysophilia's Virgin Mary, and the one on the right is Andre Serrano's Piss Christ. And these were both vandalized in museums. So here's what they looked like beforehand. These are also two complex works that we could talk a lot about, and maybe you're already familiar. Andre Serrano's piece on the right-hand side, it's in an immersion series because he took objects and immersed them in various fluids, in this instance in urine, and photographed them. He's a photographer. It was vandalized because it was received as scandalous in the 1980s, but you have to also know that he's working in New York City during the height of the AIDS crisis. And so to make work that is centered on body fluids is one way of kind of thinking about that crisis. And he's also identifies as Catholic and was raised Catholic. So it was, I think in his mind, a way of thinking, excuse me, about thinking about the incarnation, and also thinking about, just the humanity and body of Jesus. He went to the bathroom too. But it was certainly provocative, right? There's been all kinds of coverage of that. The image on the left is Chrysophilia's Holy Virgin Mary, in which he uses elephant dung to create her breast on the left-hand side of the image. And then also on the bottom, the whole image is propped up on two balls of elephant dung that have her title, Virgin Mary, in them. And this, again, was one that was received, I think, too quickly as being disrespectful and irreverent. He is a British-born and British-based artist, but had received arts grants to also travel and study in Africa. And so his use of elephant dung, he describes as being tied to fertility in the land, And he's obviously in this image, he's pushing back on the, white European Renaissance era depictions of Mary. Instead, he's doing one that is just being blatant about the fertility, the celebration of fertility that's already in those Renaissance images that we often don't see because we're so used to seeing them, by which I mean Mary's exposed breast, for example, right? These kind of butterfly looking things are actually women's bottoms from pornographic magazines. So he is very, I'm not saying it's not provocative, but what he's doing is trying to heighten our, maybe should have thought twice before showing this image in a church adult ed that I haven't been to this church before, but I'm hoping you'll roll with me on this. It may be my first and last time being invited here. I guess I'd say that in these kinds of conversations, we may have reactions right away. And when I've taught this material, I've certainly received a variety of reactions from students, and that's okay. You're entitled to those reactions, but maybe then take a minute to reflect on, why am I having this reaction, right? Why is this making me uncomfortable? Why am I frustrated or angry or worried or, and then take the time to think through that. And you don't have to know right away. That's okay. Of course, since I'm a medieval historian, I have to show you some medieval images. These are some examples of destruction of images in medieval manuscripts, which is actually very common. And these fall into a few categories. So here's an image where the face of God the Father has been painted over. So that's interesting. There's kind of a theological concern here about depicting the Father in human form. Most of what we see in the destruction of images in medieval manuscripts is what I call performative piety, where people scratch out the bad guys, basically. With medieval manuscripts, the page is made from vellum or parchment. It's very durable. It's animal skin. So it means that you can scrape pigment off and not destroy the page itself, or you can kind of lick your thumb and smudge it away. So here is a kind of a funny marginal figure that has a nun, and she's being accosted by probably what was a lewd monastic figure here. This is an image from the Psalms where there was two kind of like copulating figures here that have been removed. And then in this instance, demons kind of pulling at a monk, and those demons have been scratched out. I should say another way that images get destroyed is through use. So affectionate use. So we also have images in medieval manuscripts where the face of Jesus or the feet of Jesus have been totally removed because they were kissed so often, right? So it's not always destroying images because somebody disagrees with them or wants to show that they, that this demon is bad, and so we're going to scratch them out. It's also through use and affection. By way of, I think, conclusion here, I'll end with this, which is an image that's not too far from here and is no longer there, but this is in the park very close to the MIA. And this statue of George Washington was torn down in November of 2020. And one of my students wrote a paper on this, actually, because her house is just across the street, and she kind of observed the process of it being laid out here for quite some time, and then eventually it was taken away, and then there was just an empty space. And so she came to think about what do we do as a community with these, and how do we kind of learn from that process of removal? Could we develop rituals of removal of images so that there's an educational process and a kind of healing that could happen, and think maybe a little bit more long-term about this removal? Could we create a digital archive? Could we, because if it is totally gone, then do we learn from it? Could we erect an empty pedestal? It's a huge question. And there's actually the Monument Lab, if you haven't heard of them. They're very interesting, and they have a NEH. They had an NEH funded project where they did an audit of all of the public monuments in the United States. You can get this for $15 in a print copy, and shows actually the breakdown of who is commemorated in the US publicly, how much do those monuments cost to keep up every year. It's a lot of money, actually. And that was a helpful kind of assessment, I think. So I think I should probably pause here. I guess I'll close with that one, is to say that iconoclasm and removal, there's an art historian, Michael Camille, whose work I find helpful in this, is that we can think of these as not just negation. Removal isn't necessarily just negation, but, and in these ways too, can be considered an assertion of new meaning. Okay, so it's not merely a negative thing, but is also positing something new. So in this case, instead of painting over these figures, instead of cutting them out of the manuscript, the person who made these changes leaves those marks for us to see. And so they're leaving behind something for us to see how they engage with the manuscript, if that makes sense. Okay, I hope that some of that was helpful. I know it's a lot of kind of big things maybe, but I'll hand it over to Pastor Ingrid for some setting us up for questions and conversation.
I'm gonna stop sharing.
Yeah, I'll stop share. I also have a bibliography that I'll put in the chat maybe later, or can send out digitally if you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to think about. Last week we ran out of time for conversation, so we wanted to have more time this week. We only have about 5 minutes, but I'm wondering if, no, 5 minutes. If you can find somebody who you don't live with, to have a conversation, and we'll be able to put people in groups of 2 online too. Doug will do that. A couple of questions to discuss. So in your own experience, how does faith influence art, and how does art influence faith? So I'll repeat it one more time. How does faith influence art, and how does art influence faith? If that question doesn't resonate with you, then you might talk about something else that did from the presentation. But that's a question that our presenter thinks will be helpful in the wake of what she said. So how does faith influence art? How does art influence faith? So turn to somebody for 5 minutes, and then we'll have some opportunity to come back together in large group after that.
Hey. Yeah. It's kind of interesting. Don and I very sort of things. Yeah. You start. Yeah, probably. It was. I should laugh. Thanks. Okay. It'll take about 55 seconds, so they'll.
Okay. All right, welcome back. Take about 30 seconds to close your conversations. And we'll bring the online folks back. I hope you had really good conversations with one another, and we could probably have like 4 hours of conversation on that particular question. So hopefully you'll have that same conversation with people in your own family friend arena in this coming week, and that you'll continue the conversation for days and weeks to come. We're going to just welcome large group questions for just a few minutes because that's all we have left. But know that next week we are going to do the whole time as Q&A time. So those of you who left questions, we had a question left over on the table last week. And if you have questions that are really stirring in your brain this week, feel free to leave them over on the table for next week as well, because that'll really form the basis of our conversation for next week's forum. I have to run upstairs and get dressed, but thank you so much for coming back and answering a few large group questions. So.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the conversation. My understanding is we maybe have like 5 minutes, something like that. So if there's anything you want to share and report back from your conversation or burning questions you have, yeah.
Could you say just a couple of words about how particularly difficult you are that the
Revolutionary. So the question is, can I say a few words about religious and theological art being revolutionary? And what do we mean by revolutionary?
challenge your assumptions, challenge biases, and hopefully bring you to that.
So to challenge biases and assumptions and maybe to move you to action, right? Oh, yeah, that's really good. Well, it's certainly possible. And I think that that's why having conversations and being open to that prophetic role or revolutionary role of art is so important. Because if we kind of limit what religious art is, it's going to stay kind of backward facing and stagnant. And I'm, I said, I'm coming from the Orthodox Church here. So we have icons are incorporated into our worship. There's a very long history and it is very kind of codified. I wouldn't call it stagnant per se, but it is, a very strong tradition. So I'm very aware of the kind of complexities of being in a church that maybe has that. And yet, I think that a necessary role of the arts, and especially what my program at United is trying to do, is to push those boundaries. I think performance art is one place that happens, actually. There's a little feedback coming on some mic somewhere, but so yeah, I think performance art, exactly because it is community-based and communal, is one place that can happen. And I think too, the first thing that comes to mind for me is thinking about the artwork that's been tied to the protests of the last several years, where you have, say, from puppetry to mural art. So there are things that are being kind of emerging from communities and like on the ground, which I think is a very, that's tied to rituals of mourning and celebration. And, I've focused on visual art here because I'm an art historian, but performance art and music is also an important part of that too. I think I'm being probably too vague to answer your question. Yeah, I think in that I kind of and that's where I look to I would want to expand. It's kind of like a twofold answer in that That's why I think looking at what contemporary artists are doing is so important, whether or not they identify as religious themselves, because again, they're drawing on religious iconography and they are doing some of that work. And then the other thing is that I think it's really important for faith communities to invite artists into their spaces and to commission them to do work. To pay artists is really an ethically important thing. So to have them do, I think it's wrong actually to ask artists to do labor for free in church communities. I know, because it's often like, well, it'll be your ministry or you'll get exposure. So, no, you should pay artists. Just pay artists. They never get paid. So that's one of my things too. But that to have conversations, and I think the series that you're doing here is a really good model for that, and showing that openness and curiosity to these kind of difficult conversations is commendable, I think. So, yes.
Yes, I'm intrigued by the fact that you're a member of Holy Trinity congregation.
Yeah.
Orthodox.
Yeah.
And so I checked the website.
Uh-huh.
It's a fantastic sanctuary.
It is, yes.
Rich,
Yeah.
beautiful, and powerful, filled with icons.
Mm-hmm.
And notice also on your website that you have become more diverse in membership over the past 10, 20 years.
Yeah, that
Has
probably.
that been reflected in what you have done with your
Icons?
icons? No,
Yeah.
the icons that are not stained glass, so that
Yeah, we do have stained glass. I hope you found the right website. I guess there's probably lots of Holy Trinities. We're on Forest Street in St. Paul.
I'm familiar.
You're familiar with Holy Trinity? Okay. Oh, great. Yeah, so, and actually I was just talking to Pastor Ingrid about it. So our community is maybe, the church is like 125 years old, something like that.
The same age as this church.
Yeah, it was founded by Ukrainian and Russian immigrants. And we still have several Ukrainian and Russian families in our church today, which, as I was saying, obviously with the war in Russia right now is of great concern. Well, Russia's war on Ukraine is of great concern because we have extended members who are fleeing Kyiv, for example, right now. Yeah, so that's a very pressing concern for us. The icons that are directly on the walls and everything are relatively recent in the last 20 years. Was an ongoing process. And then we have older icons that are, like individual icons that are also hung up in the space. And the stained glass windows date to the early 20th century and are, still have their kind of original Russian inscriptions, were given in memory of various folks. Also part of why I'm interested in the conversation that you all are having, because we have members in our community who are descendants of the people who installed those and were, immigrants coming to America. And so it's very important to set this up. And actually I was thinking the other day, I don't know that our community could ever handle having those taken down because of that context, and because of still how the immigrant experience in America still. We have some, yes, this is exactly what I was talking to Pastor Ingrid about, which is that, we have some icons of African saints, but some of us younger converts to Orthodoxy have been raising the question, because the community that we live in is still, our immediate neighborhood is still predominantly an immigrant community. And so we are thinking about, what does hospitality look like, and how do we represent diversity that reflects the community that the church is located in. So we're kind of, asking those questions and thinking about, like, can we get new icons commissioned? Because the Orthodox Church certainly has a history of diversity, and to this day, of course, there's our churches here, our brothers and sisters and siblings here in the Twin Cities that are Ethiopian and Coptic and so on. So it's not for lack of sources and history is what I'm saying, but it's more about the individual kind of context of these different churches.
But you do have some sense of the need for retaining the images for the sake of the older.
From the older, yeah. Yeah, well, it's been interesting we've had some conversations in our adult ed actually about, you know, these icons, and it's interesting to hear some of the older Russian folks, their interpretations of the icons versus like how we're kind of saying, well, you know, so they will describe them as being spiritual, and so therefore not needing to reflect the local context. We'll say, well, it's still doing that, however you want to interpret it. It's still making a kind of claim, so we need to think about that. So it's a difficult.
Particularly in the context of the war.
Yeah. Thank you. So Randy, should we? Yeah. So we should, class dismissed. We should go. But thank you very much for your time and conversation. I appreciate it. Thank you to the Zoomers. I did a bad job of, I'm used to looking at the camera on my computer in class and not on the camera up there, but thank you for being here.
Thank you, Jenna.